Now that we learned about funcs and func action creators, so these action creator functions here, now that we learned about that, let's build another action creator that fetches the card when the application loads. Because at the moment we're only sending data, but we never fetch data when the application load. And therefore, if we reload, all our state is still lost. And that's of course not the goal. Now we can write that code in the component or as an action creator, but here I now want to stick to action creators. And hence we can add a second function in card slice. But since this file is now getting bigger and bigger, I'm a fan of creating a separate file for that. Let's maybe name it card actions.js. Of course, the file name is up to you. I'll then copy this send card data function, cut it from card slice, and add it to card actions. And now we need to import UI actions here. So in card slice, I'll get rid of that import, cut that, and add that in card actions instead. And in app.js, we therefore now need to import send card data from store/card actions. And then I'll add my other action creator function in this card actions file as well. So that could be the fetch card data function. And I'll also export that because we'll need it somewhere else as well. And just as before, that will immediately return a function which gets dispatched as an argument and then does something else. Now here we could then also dispatch some notifications if we want to do that, but actually here I'll not do that. Instead, I'll create a new function, fetch data, another nested function which is async, because I'll use the fetch API and I want to wrap fetch data with try catch thereafter. That's why I'm putting it into a separate function. So then we await fetch and get a response here. And I want to fetch by sending a request to that same URL again, but this time it should be a GET request. So we don't need to add this configuration object then as a second parameter because a GET request is the default anyways. Instead, this time I'm now interested in the data. So in the result of calling await response JSON. But of course, I also still want to check if the response is maybe not okay for whatever reason. And if that should be the case, I'll throw a new error where I say could not fetch card data. Something like this. Now, if we make it past this line of code here, though, we have the data, and I'll then simply return it here. I'll return it here because that is in a separate nested function. Hence here, I'll then try executing fetch data and catch any errors we might be getting. And if we get an error, we still might want to show the error notification. So I'll then dispatch this error notification action again down here. But I'll say fetching card data failed. If we, however, are in the try block, I'll await fetch data. I can do this if I turn this into an async function, which we can. Redux supports that this function which we return here is async. So we can use await here as well. And that gives me my card data then, because I'm returning the data which we parse here. And therefore now I want to use that card data to set my card. Now the card data we're fetching will have that format which is stored on Firebase. And that's the format which we're sending to Firebase, of course. It will be this card which we're sending there. So it is an object with an items key, with an array inside, and a total quantity key, which is exactly the format we need here in our frontend as well. Which is no surprise because we are sending that Redux state snapshot as data to the backend in the end. So we automatically get back correctly formatted data here, and we don't need to transform that Firebase data first, because it has the format we sent to Firebase earlier. That's different from other sections in the course. There we had to transform Firebase data because there we used post for sending our data, not put as we're doing here, and hence we let Firebase create a list of data, which turned out to be an object when we fetched it. You might remember that from the HTTP section in the course. Here with put, we're sending our data snapshot to Firebase, and Firebase will take it as it is and store it like it is, without changing it. So when we then fetch it, we also have the correct structure, and hence this card data is correctly formatted, and therefore now we can use this replace card reducer, which I provided to you earlier in this module, to replace our front-end card with the card we're loading from Firebase. And replace card expects a payload which has a total quantity and an items field, which is exactly the data structure we're fetching from Firebase. So in card actions, we just want to import our card actions from the card slice, so these automatically generated actions now. And here I then want to dispatch card actions, replace, not remove, replace card, and pass my card data as a payload, which, as mentioned, has the correct structure already. Now we could then also show the success notification, but I don't want to do that. I just want to use the card data and we're good to go. With all that done, we now just need to call fetch card data somewhere in our application to start fetching our card data from Firebase. And again, app.js is probably a good place for that. Here we already have a useFact call, and we want to start fetching data here if this application loads. We could do that here in this isInitialCheck, because that will only run if it's the first time that this effect runs, but I think it's cleaner to create a separate effect which simply doesn't have any dependencies, and which therefore also will only run if this component was rendered for the first time. And since it's our main component, this will only render once. And therefore here we can then dispatch this new card action we created, this custom card action. So this fetch card data action, I want to dispatch this here. Add dispatch as a dependency for completeness sake, but as I said, that will never change, so this effect will never rerun. And that will dispatch this whenever our application starts. Hence, if we save this and reload, you'll see that this gets populated. But you'll also notice that for some reason, we also see send card data successfully here. And we are sending a request to Firebase for storing the card data again. So we're fetching it. As we can tell, we have our card data here. And if I change it and reload, we see we fetch that changed data. But at the same time, we seem to be sending it again. And do you know why? We are sending it again because in app.js, we have this effect for sending the card data, which will execute whenever the card changed. The problem is when we fetch the card data, once fetching is done, we replace the card, right? We replace the card here with that fetched data. That changes the card inside of Redux. Now, since that card then changed, we trigger this other effect and send the card data again. So how can we now work around that? As always in programming, there will be multiple ways of fixing that issue we detected in the last lecture, where we automatically resend the card when the application loaded. One possible solution could be to go to our card slice, and here in that initial state, we, for example, add a changed property, which is false, let's say. And we don't change this if we replace the card, but we do change it if we add or remove items to or from the card. Then we set state changed to true. And the remove item from card and add item to card are only executed from our local application. So when we fetch data from Firebase, where we then execute replace card, this will not change. It will stay false. Now, how can this help us? Well, in app.js, where we have this effect for sending card data, we can also check if card changed. So if our card, which we're selecting here, if that changed property is true, And only if it's true, we want to dispatch and send the card data. If it's false, so if it hasn't changed locally, we don't want to send it. And with this simple change implemented, if we reload, we're not sending this again. Only if I add something to the card. Now, as a side note, this changed property is now also part of Firebase because we're sending the overall card state as it's stored by Redux to Firebase. If we would want to avoid this, we could of course go to the card actions, and there where we send our card data, instead of taking the whole card, we could create a new object where we then just use items from card items and just the total quantity from card.total quantity. So we would create a new object which does not contain changed. That's something we could do. And with that, it is removed if we send something. Now it's no longer part of Firebase. So now that should be working as we want. Now we can add items to the card, change our card however we need to, add more and less. And that is then synced to Firebase. Though I see that the price here doesn't update correctly, we should look into this. But that's now synced to Firebase. And therefore, this now works, at least when it comes to the side effects and to HTTP requests. We are, of course, also loading data correctly. I just detected that we have an issue regarding the price. It does not update correctly if I reduce my card quantity. So let's quickly look into that here in card slice, in remove item from cart. Yeah, for existing items, I'm reducing the quantity, but I'm not updating the price. We should, of course, be doing that. I'll set total price equal to existing item dot total price, not total quantity, thank you, total price minus existing item dot price to reduce the total price by the price of a single item, since we're removing a single item. If we do that, and I reload, and I clear my card to start from scratch again, if we do that, and I try to start adding again, we get another error. And that actually is an expected error, which I wanted to dive in. We're getting this error because I cleared my card entirely and I reloaded, and therefore I fetched my card data from Firebase. Since I cleared the card entirely though, we see that on Firebase here, we have no items key in the card anymore. So we fetched that data from Firebase and we set our local card to the fetched card, and that means that items is now not an empty array, but undefined, and therefore trying to call find on undefined fails. To solve this, we should go to card actions and to the place where we fetch our card, and then when we replace our card with card data, there indeed is a tiny transformation we should make. We should make sure that the payload we pass to replace card is an object which always has an items key, which is either card data.items, or, if that should be undefined and therefore falsy, an empty array. And total quantity is always card data.total quantity, because that still is part of Firebase. With that, we ensure that we never end up with items being undefined. Instead, it will always be an empty array. With that, if we reload, we can add to the card again. And now we can also deduct items from the cart, and now the price updates correctly. Can reload again. And this now all works. And now we also implemented HTTP and side effects with Redux, and you'll learn about different approaches of doing that. So now our card is working correctly, and we learned a lot about where to put code, how to run async code with Redux, and how to handle side effects. And we spent a lot of time on that because it is an important topic, and knowing your options there is extremely important. I can't emphasize this enough. It's important to understand how that works. But besides handling async tasks and side effects with Redux and understanding where to put our code, there also was another important topic I wanted to have a look at in this module. And that would be the Redux DevTools. These are extra tools which we can use, which make debugging Redux and our Redux state a bit easier. Because in more complex applications with a lot of Redux state handled by a lot of different slices and a lot of different actions going on, it can be difficult to find errors in your debug state, in the order of your actions, and so on. And sometimes it might be interesting to look into the current state of your overall Redux store without having to dive into different parts of the UI to verify that everything works correctly. And that is what we can use the Redux DevTools for. You can simply search for Redux DevTools, and you'll find a GitHub repository about the Redux DevTools. And the Redux DevTools can be used and installed as a browser extension. You can also install them as a standalone app, but I personally find the browser extension easiest to use. So here I'm on Chrome, so I'll pick that Chrome browser extension, and here you can install this Chrome extension. Now I already do have it installed. You can install it with a click of a button, and once you did so, you will be able to use it right away. When using Redux without Redux Toolkit, you had to set up some extra code to make Redux DevTools work. With Redux Toolkit, it will conveniently work out of the box, and you should then have access to that extension. Now here I have an incognito tab open, and there I don't have access to my extensions, so I'll quickly run the application in a standard Chrome tab again, and when I do so, I have this Redux DevTools icon here. Or in the browser DevTools, you also should find Redux here as an option. And if you open that, it will open this Redux DevTools panel here. And now here you have insights into your Redux store, into your actions, and much more. On the left side, you, for example, see the actions that were dispatched. And if I reload, we see that's init and replace cart. Init is this automatically dispatched first action that applies all your initial states to Redux, so that initializes the store. And replace cart was dispatched because we fetched the cart initially. Now if I add something to the cart, you see add item to cart was dispatched and our show notification actions, which makes sense because these are all the actions which are being dispatched when we add an item. First add item to cart is dispatched, and when that cart state then changed, useEffect in app.js kicks in and dispatches send cart data. That's not logged because that itself is not an action type, but instead as part of send cart data, we then do dispatch these notification actions, which is why we see them here as well. And you can click on those actions to get insights into the data that was transported by that action and how that changed your state. You see the data if you click on action. There you see the payload of the action and this unique identifier. Here we can also see the automatically created unique identifiers Redux Toolkit gives us. As you see, it's basically your slice name. So in cart, it's this slice name. And then the method name of this reducer method, that is the unique identifier created by Redux Toolkit. And then here we have our payload. We also see how the state looks like thereafter. So how the state looks after this action was performed. And we see how it was updated if we click on diff. There for add item to cart, we see that the total quantity was changed from 6 to 7, changed was set from false to true, and in the items we see that the quantity of that first item changed, and so on. So that's super useful to understand the impact of your actions. You can even do something which is called time traveling. You can jump to an older state like this one by clicking on it and then clicking on jump. And you see, now the notification is gone and we're back to the cart with 6 items. And we can then start debugging here again if we want to. And we can then also jump back to a newer state if we want to. So that can be really convenient, and therefore the Redux DevTools are a piece of software I can only encourage you to use and play around with to get deeper insights into your Redux store and to debug your Redux behavior and fully understand what's going on. Now with that, that's it for this module. We again practiced using Redux, and more importantly, we learned about a very important concept. We learned about Redux and side effects and asynchronous code. we learned that there are different places where we can put this asynchronous code or where we can put such side effects, our components or action creators, and we saw both in action. We also saw how not to do it when we added all the data transformation code in the component, which led to a very fat component. And whilst that was working, it simply was not the idea behind using Redux. There, you should prefer reducers for data transformations and only put side effects or async code into your components or action creators. So that's what we did thereafter. And we then also moved from component to action creator to learn about that concept as well, which allows us to keep our components lean and focused on a couple of core tasks instead of doing all the heavy lifting. Then at the end, we also had a look at the Redux DevTools, another important piece of software which allows us to fully understand our Redux store and state and what's going on, where we can time travel, and where we can gain deep insights into Redux. And therefore, now after this module, you learned a lot about Redux, a lot of advanced concepts, and you are ready to use Redux in any kind of application you might be building with any kind of logic you might have in this application, including side effects, HTTP requests, or any other kind of async code.